Welcome everybody. This is another session on one question a day. Today we will be discussing on the question development of palate and midface. The key to this will be when the palate starts to form at about the 4th week of intrauterine life, when the facial prominence arises under the influence of the first pharyngeal arches appears, of which the maxillary prominences, the mandibular prominences, the frontonasal prominences, the role of the nasal placodes, the nasal pits, nasal prominences, how the lateral, medial, nasolacrimal groove, nasolacrimal duct formation, lacrimal sex, and the formation of cheek and maxilla. The role of 5 facial prominence, the frontal, medial, nasal prominence, the lateral nasal prominence, the skin innervations, the Reichert Cartilage, and the diagrams for these questions. We will be concentrating more on the development of palate that happens, the question which happens to be very frequent in the university exams. All starts with the formation of the mandibular arch. The maxillary process and the mandibular process are involved, of which the maxillary process has palatal shelves. At about the 7 to 8 weeks, the palatal shelves of the maxillary process fuse to each other to form the secondary palate. Initially, the palate cells are directed downwards in growth. As the tongue comes downwards, the palatal cells are elevated and fuse with each other to form the palate. The fusion of the primary and secondary palate. Draw this diagram at this point of time where you mention about the hard palate, soft palate. And in this process, there are 3 fusions involved. Fusion of the primary palate with the palatine cells to form the maxilla, fusion of the 2 palatal processes, and fusion of palatal process with the nasal cell. The proper palate is the anterior, proper palate is formed by the anterior 3/4 ossifications, which forms the hard palate, and the posterior 1/4, which forms the soft palate. Development of palate occurs with the fusion of the primary palate with the secondary palate to form the proper palate. The formation of primary palate, which occurs at the 28th day of the intrauterine life or at the 4th week, which is initiated as localized thickenings around the frontonasal process along the side of the olfactory placode, and there is a mesenchymal proliferations around this olfactory placodes, gives a horseshoe shape to form the olfactory pit, which medially arises to give the medial nasal process and laterally as the lateral nasal process. The medial nasal process on either sides of both sides fuses to form the primary palate, which happens about the 7 to 8 weeks. Formation of secondary palate, draw the diagram clearly, and through the intramembranous ossification at about the secondary weeks, at the primary ossification center on either side of the symphysis, this is the mandible going. Tentatively, we will stop with the mandibular and go into the palatal. To recapitulate, development of palate, primary palate fuses with the secondary palate to form the proper palate. The formation of primary palate, 28th day, along the frontonasal process, which arises from the olfactory placode that gives rise to the olfactory pit, the medially and laterally, medially the medial nasal process, laterally the lateral process. The medial nasal process on fuses both sides to form the primary palate. Draw the diagrams very carefully, and you will find the formation of secondary palate. The timeline of this, starting with the pharyngeal arches about the 4th weeks or 28th day, the formation of external face, the primary palate, the secondary palate, completion of that soft palate, which occurs about the 12 weeks. Clinical significance, any abnormality in this will give rise to cleft lip and palate. This is the most important clinical correlation. Why do we need to study about the development of palate?